right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much and welcome to the Wilson Center. And thank you for coming today to A More Resilient World, the role of population and family planning in sustainable development. And I'm very pleased to see you all here today. And for you'll still be able to go to the parade afterwards. Once we're done, you'll be right in the middle of it, actually. So thank you all for braving the crowds this morning. And a special welcome, of course, to those of you watching live online. We're very pleased that everyone could join us. So I'm Megan Parker. I'm the senior writer editor here at the Wilson Center, and I'm also partnerships director for our environmental change and security program. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming you here today, but a little sad to say that our original moderator, Roger Mark D'Souza, cannot join us today due to a death in the family. So, and if you, many of you probably knew Roger Mark, and if you did, you knew that population, family planning, and the connections to resilience was one of his favorite topics. So I know he is thinking he would want to be here today if he could, but please keep him in your thoughts. Another change to our program that I'm sorry to say is that Alessandro had an accident this morning and will not be joining our panel. So please also send him your good thoughts. Luckily, we have an incredible panel of experts who also know quite a bit about food and agriculture, which Alessandro was going to talk to us about today, and they'll be able to share their wisdom with you on that subject. So just a few quick words about where you're sitting. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the living formal memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was the only president with a PhD. And in honor of his founding of the League of Nations, our mission is to bridge the gap between scholarship and policy in the world of international affairs. And we also seek to bridge the gaps between issues and sectors as well. And for almost 25 years, my program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, has championed an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how population dynamics and access to healthcare are connected to our sustainability, to our prosperity, and our security. And we, a number of years ago, produced a 3-part documentary series called Healthy People, Healthy Environment, which you can find outside. There's some copies of the DVDs, and I encourage you to watch them because it really shows you how these connections work in the countries where people live, most closely connected to their environment, their natural resources. So today's event is right in line with that long tradition in our work, and it is the second in a 3-part series on population and family planning and the contribution to meeting global goals. Today we'll focus on those goals that relate to the environment and to the essential natural resources like food and water, but also to responding to natural disasters and to all of the challenges that we face today that are transboundary and transnational. Our panel of experts will discuss how population dynamics drives demand and then the role of family planning in increasing resilience to these challenges. Yeah, I'd very much like to thank our partners at Population Reference Bureau's PACE project, which stands for Policy, Advocacy, and Communication Enhanced for Population and Reproductive Health, for their support and assistance on this important series. And I hope you'll come back again on July 10th for the third and final event in that series, which will look at the connections to the goals on prosperity. And a big thank you to our keynote speaker, Franklin Moore. Franklin is the Chief of Programs for AfriCare, a leading NGO committed to addressing African development and policy issues by working in partnership with the African people to build sustainable, healthy, and productive communities. And prior to joining AfriCare, Franklin served 2 terms as Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Africa Bureau, and he was also director of USAID's Office of Environment and Science Policy. So he is the perfect person to kick off today's discussion. After Franklin speaks, I'll introduce our panelists, and they'll show their perspectives, and then we'll have a very productive Q&A after the sessions. So start thinking now about your questions, and make sure they're questions, not speeches. And if you're watching online, you can tweet your question to @NewSecurityBeat using the hashtag the PACE Project or hashtag #PopEnviro. So Franklin?
Thank you. They gave me kind of a difficult task today, but this will be fun. I'm hoping I can say a little bit about AfriCare, a little bit about resilience, And I'll get to what we do related to population dynamics, but I'll get there by way of talking about what we do for women as well, because that's a very important component of that. Um, Africare. So Africare is an organization that started in 1970 in the Sahel, in Niger specifically. And we find that by 1971, one has the first large drought that took place in the Sahel. If you look at countries like Ghana or Benin, etc., you'll find that in 71 was the first time that the northernmost parts of their country really began to feel severe drought. So Africares got involved in emergency responses almost immediately. And Africare's emergency response was built on, and Africare activities are built on, a strong belief that community mobilization and local capacity building and innovation are the cornerstones of successful development. And that for us includes resilience. What resilience for us does formally is it recognizes that the true solutions to long-term development in places that particularly are having environmental shock is to recognize that dealing with them currently is a mixture of a humanitarian response and a development response. And community engagement, capacity building, and looking at local driven behavior and social change are what empower communities. So our approach is very much an approach that looks at the organization of the community and how the organization of the community affects what the community is doing, who the community is, and in fact, the size of the community. As we look at resilience, there are three capacities that we seek to have an effect on, and those capacities provide both short-term and long-term benefit to communities. The first one is absorptive capacity, where one works with individuals, households, and communities to first try to, if possible, reduce whatever the risk is and to better absorb the impacts of the shocks without permanent negative effects. There's adaptive capacity, which is improving the flexibility to respond to long-term change. And in some ways, most importantly, transformative capacity. That's where we find the innovations in institutional reform, behavior shifts, culture change. And it's very important because often in this area, one is seeking to have behavior and social change. So there's a strong component of behavior and social change communication that takes place with that community and helps that community to better understand where and how they may have innovation. To give you one example, we had someone who was going to speak on agriculture, so I'll give you one agricultural example. And it is an example that is working with unusually agropastoralists. And if you know the Sahel, agropastoralism is really one of the biggest livelihood and lifestyle in the area. And so, of course, agropastoralists are heavily affected by drought, which affects their pattern of movement, has affected those places where they normally would be taking herds, and we're talking mostly sheep and goats, but mainly where they would be taking herds to graze, and affects grazing land. So what does one do from a resilient point of view with these populations, and what are the things these populations decide they want to do? Well, one of the big things you will find in the Sahel, and this flows from the humanitarian funding side. You know, in the United States, and in Europe, we have these two big funding streams. One is humanitarian, one is development. And if you look over the past sort of 8 years, there has been more of an effort to try to make those parallel and synergistic. So often now when one is doing work with communities around resilience, some of the money you have comes from humanitarian sources and some comes from development. In this case, from humanitarian sources, namely cash for work, we've worked with communities to recover 2,000 plus hectares of degraded land. And that's done mainly with Zais or half moons. I don't know whether people are familiar with what the Zai half moon is. It's a traditional knowledge that has been improved with modern scientific knowledge. And it goes into a degraded area and literally creates what is a half moon. And in that half moon, there's a planting of a tree, and there's a planting of some other grasses in that half moon. From a point of view of pastoralists, it provides fodder, but when there is drought, which tends to kill off the grasses, often the tree remains. So that tree in emergency times can also provide some fodder. If one were to visit Niger, there are portions of Niger that engaged in half-moon recovery and rehabilitation of land 40 years ago that you would never know they had ever been degraded. So this is one of the humanitarian things that takes place that does really affect the rehabilitation of the environment. From development funds, we worked with that same group of farmers to plant cowpea, and we had drought-resistant cowpea and forage sorghum. Now, the forage sorghum is something new for many of these communities. With the forage sorghum, we produced 57,000 tons of forage, was harvested and stored. What is taking place when I talk about transformative capacity is an innovation, because many of these communities who now have grown forage and packed it away now can engage in feeding their animals as opposed to just making use of grazing land. And it has affected communities, particularly in their relationship with water use, because it allows the communities to spend more time in areas where they have water available because they do have something to feed their livestock. And it has caused them to increase in semi-intensive livestock feeding, less dependency on grazing, and in last year led to we're responding to we're cataloging our results from some activities that took place in 2012. There was 2011 severe drought. And we found that in 2012 that there was a decline of 14% in livestock mortality. What it is helping, the innovation it is bringing, is helping those communities who in a normal drought would sell off all their animals or all their animals would die. So that when you come back to the next year, you really have destroyed the resource base of the community. This move to semi-intensive livestock feeding has allowed them to maintain their herd through these bad periods so that it does not destroy the resource base so much. Now, a little bit on women and population dynamic. As I've said, we believe very strongly in community organization and community decision making. Because of that, we believe that community empowerment is increased with the use of these organizations and combining them with what we would refer to as social and behavior change communication. And in many cases, that communication is targeted. So in a number of countries in the Sahel, we have what are called husband schools. And husband schools are part of the community that is bringing new knowledge to men. It is bringing new knowledge to men particularly because when we, and in the Sahel, we tend to talk about child spacing. When we talk about child spacing, it is critically important that the men know as much or more about this than the women do, because it's often the men through whom one has to go to actually have a family consider the idea of child spacing. So the husband schools are particularly important for us. As we do those community groups, though, one of the things we are very conscious of is leadership and positions of influence. So often as we do community groups, there are cases where the community is subjected to quotas. So in Niger, for example, for the food security committees, in Niger, food security committees are required to have at least 30% of their members women. And quite often, in that situation, as well as we have other situations, we have one where we have community food distribution committees, and those community food distribution committees actually make some decisions upon how external resources will be shared among the community and create some important relationships that help community members to share among themselves at points in time. But for some of our food distribution committees, our one in Zimbabwe, in a very similar situation, requires that 80% of the members be female, because food distribution is really something that females know a whole lot more about than males. And in those situations, we are often engaged in some tutoring and some training to help the women so that they understand clearly that they are in positions of influence and positions of leadership. And we find that that helps the community to make some transitions in behavioral shifts and to adopt new innovations. That rebalancing of power that takes place as a result of the committee work has also had an effect on women's understanding of child spacing as well as men's understanding of child spacing. The other thing I would say we do that looks somewhat at population dynamics. Of course, in the midst of the emergency, there tends to be an evaluation of children within the community, where we're looking for particularly severe acute malnourished children and moderately acute malnourished children. Now, the severe ones go into the health practice, but those that are moderate go through a 12-day program that includes the child and the mother. And during that period, there is a feeding program that is laid out for the child, and the mother is educated on many of those additional crops, educated some on cooking, preparation, etc. But there also is health education, and that health education includes an education on child spacing. So hopefully there are some ideas of an active NGO that has been working in the Sahel for about 40 years, and I would say has learned a lot about, in particular, working with the communities themselves and helping the communities to decide what for them are innovations they want to hold on to them, what for them are behavior changes that they want to make within their community. And so you will find that a fair number of them do make changes as they relate to child spacing. You also find a fair number of them make changes as it relates to their agricultural pursuits and the ability to increase the nutritious food that they're producing both for pregnant women and for children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Franklin. That was great. I especially like the reminder of the different time scales that we need to focus on. You know, all the way from the near-term shocks through long-term change to really transformative development. And we were talking before the event actually about how one of the benefits of looking at things through the perspective of population dynamics and demographic trends is that you can be able to take a longer term view about what communities need and what really help them become resilient in the long term. And the importance of child spacing as well in terms of the long-term impact of that time dynamic there. I also am a big fan of husband school. I think that sounds like a great idea, especially if it leads to female leadership. So thank you very much, Franklin, for those remarks. So I am very pleased to now introduce you to three experts who will share their perspectives on a range of topics. Also, it's great that we have a range of approaches represented here today, including research, programming, partnerships, and data. You all have their bios, so I won't go into great detail, but I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists right now in the order in which they will speak. So first up is Eric Fiala, who is the director of Winrock International's USAID-funded Sustainable Water Partnership, and a civil engineer with 25 years of international experience in water resource and irrigation engineering. And here at the Wilson Center, we've been very pleased to partner with Eric in Winrock on a series we just concluded on sustainable water. And if you missed those events, you can watch them all online. Next, we will go to Skype all the way to Pakistan to Zeba Saithar, who is an internationally recognized demographer who leads the Population Council as country director in the Islamabad office, where she's been since 2002. Zeba has a PhD in medical demography from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she spent more than 15 years at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and has worked with a wide range of other organizations. So we're very grateful that she is able to join us via Skype, and so far so good. We'll hope that it continues to work this well. And then finally, batting cleanup is a longtime friend of the Wilson Center's Jason Bremner. Jason is Family Planning 2020's Data and Performance Management Director, and previously he was Associate Vice President for International Programs and the Program Director for Population Health and Environment and Deputy Director of our partners on today's event, the PACE project, when he was at PRB. So welcome back, Jason. So now we'll start with Eric, and Ben will fly. You want to run it from there?
Go on. And that's right. Okay. Thanks, Megan, and thanks for inviting me this morning. So water. Well, this morning as I was riding the metro with my fellow Caps fans, I reminded them that to produce ice, you need water. And ice is water. So that's, never miss an opportunity to do some advocacy. So the Sustainable Water Partnership, like Megan said, is funded by USAID and implemented by Winrock and a group of partners whose names and logos you can find at the bottom. So water security. This is a definition we use. It's one of many definitions that exist, but fundamentally, it's about an adaptive capacity. It's a capacity to provide water, to ensure safe access to water, to ensure that access is reliable and resilient. That's what it's about. And it's, of course, providing water for a multiplicity of users to support life on this planet and to support human activities. So in terms of activities, water security, we especially people like us living in cities, we can forget that water is used for many different things. It's not just about drinking. It's not just about washing ourselves. It's not just about hygiene. There is first the fact that many human activities, starting with, for example, with energy production, needs vast amounts of water to operate properly. There is the fact that food, 70% of water we use on this planet goes to food production, and we tend to forget that very easily. But that's something I'll get back to later on. There's, of course, ecosystems. Ecosystem not just because they are nice, but because they support many livelihoods around the world, especially in developing countries. They also have many supporting services, such as cleaning air, cleaning water. So it's not just people livelihoods, it's public health that's directly impacted by environmental health. And at the end of the day, I wanted to mention also, of course, risk. Many risks, and I'm going to elaborate a bit on that, are linked to water, floods, droughts, all this. When we talk about climate change, the main vehicle, the main impact of climate change on communities, on all of us, it's through water. There is a saying that if climate change is a shark, well, water is teeth. So that's something to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, what our program is trying to advocate, beyond implementing, we operate in several countries, beyond building the capacity of USAID staff, we also try to advocate that water security is really a cross-sectoral theme. And at the end of the day, when there is the word security, it's all about political security, national security, national stability, social stability. That's what it's about. So what's happening today, and why is population growth putting water under pressure? Well, first of all, more people, more needs for, as I mentioned, drinking, hygiene, and domestic needs. But another thing that is often overlooked is the fact that as population grow and as populations develop and as they rise their living standard, what you have, and I'm going to jump to the next slide here, what you have is you have people having their water needs expand. And the most significant manner of that reveals that expansion is food production. If you have a vegan diet, that's a column to the right, you're not going to need the same amount of water. Yeah, I should explain this table. It's cubic meters per person per year, okay? And we are looking at 3 different types of water uses: food production, domestic use, and industrial and power production, industrial uses and power production. So the column on the left is developed countries. That's a range that we have in most developed countries. On the right side, you have developing countries, okay? And I'm not going to go through details, but to keep in mind some of the figures, total for developing countries, about 1,000 cubic meter per person per year. That's, those of you who know about it, it's a scarcity threshold that is often mentioned by water specialists. In developed countries, you can go to more than twice that volume. 2,500 cubic meters, just to visualize, it's the size of an Olympic-size swimming pool. Okay, so each of us, we need a swimming pool like that every year, year after year, okay? But what I wanted to show in this picture is that as populations hopefully transition from being to developed, well, our diets change, our energy needs change, and it's not just more water per person, is that each person individually needs more water. It's not just the number of people, it's also the living standards that I'm sure all of you have heard that if everybody had the same living standards that we have in the US, this planet would really struggle even more to provide for all of us. So going back to my previous slides, I just go very quickly. As we know, associated to the development of economies and populations, urbanization, land use change, all this has also an impact on water. When you have deforestation, for example, you have less groundwater recharge, and that also impacts the availability of water. Climate change, I talked about that. And the last thing to keep in mind is that population growth also has a direct connection with how disasters impact us. My very first job, almost 30 years ago now, was in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is a country that has population that has grown drastically in the past 50 years. Well, in Bangladesh, because of the pressure of just finding a place to live, you have people really living on flood-prone areas where they shouldn't even go. For those of you who know Bangladesh, when the water goes down in Bangladesh, you have islands that appear, basically sandbars that appear in the middle of the rivers, are called bars. And you have basically local communities rushing to go to those places, to live there during the dry season, to quickly do a crop over there. Sometimes you even have communities fighting each other to access that island, because some of them, those islands, they appear and they disappear, so there is no real land rights. But it shows how population growth put population at risk for any disaster. Next flood comes. I mean, I was in Bangladesh in 91 after the big cyclone of 1991 that we all forgot. That cyclone killed 300,000 people. It's 9/11. Everybody remembers 9/11. The cyclone of 1991, nobody remembers, but 300,000 people, imagine that. So that's what happens when you have population growth. And so remember I mentioned 1,000 cubic meter per person per year. So that's what you have here. And of course, if you look at the availability of water all around the world, if we look at fresh water, renewable water, water that comes from the sky that we can mobilize year after year, on average, that amount there is an average. And of course, with climate change and long-term changes, that amount can vary a bit. But right now, at our human scale, that amount, we know how much it is. Well, as population grows, if you divide by the population, then the availability per person goes down. So what happens is that when you fall under 1,000 cubic meter per person per year, well, if you take a country like Egypt, I also lived in Egypt, now there are, I believe, around 700. When you hear the Minister of Agriculture talking about food security and that they are going to achieve food security, well, I'm sorry, sir, but to feed one person, you need 1,000, and right now you're at 700. So either you find a solution to drastically improve the productivity of your agriculture, or you're not going to make it. You're going to be importing food for a long time. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, because the direct connection I want to make is between water security and food security. And I don't want to sound like Cassander, but we have a food crisis coming. I believe the previous speaker spoke about the Sahel in 1971. If we all remember history, there were lots of famines around that time. That's why there was the Green Revolution. Green Revolution came up with a range of solutions to improve agricultural productivity. Well, that worked once, but now it's coming back to bite us. We, donors and governments around the world, have not been investing that much into irrigation, not been investing that much into agricultural water management and rain-fed agriculture. The yields, as we all know, the yields in Africa of rain-fed agriculture are extremely low and extremely unreliable. So there is a direct connection. If you don't have the water to produce food, then you can't eat. The other thing is, as we all know, in many developing countries, 50, 60, 70% of the population, they are living in rural areas. And 80 or 90% of those rural communities, they are basically farmers. I mean, they either farm or they raise livestock. So again, they need water to produce their food and to survive. They also need water for their livelihood, just to survive. So what happens when you remove water? It's not just that people are going to not have food to eat, it's people don't have anything to do. They don't have an income, they don't have a livelihood, and then you have people moving to cities, and you have the phenomena of large slum cities where people are just trying to find another source of living. So direct connection between water and exodus to cities, between water and social unrest. Talking about Sahel, there's a classical example of how, as population grow, more and more people try to go and farm along the rivers. And then you have herders who would like to bring their herds to water their livestock. And you have many, many places around the world where now you have conflicts It's a conflict around grazing rights. It's a conflict around water rights. And nowadays, those conflicts are not solved with simple weapons. They are solved with guns. So that's also what population pressure, population growth translates into. So at the end of the day, as I mentioned, water security is an issue of national security for many countries that are essential to US interest too. So that's something that fortunately more and more non-water people realize how critical water is. And the issue of accessing water in proper time, quality, and quantities is now very often quoted as one of the top 5 risks of our near future. I was told to talk also about water security and women. Well, as we all know, the first thing is that women and girls are usually the one tasked for bringing the water to home, which takes hours and hours and distracts them from, of course, education and productive activities. There's also the less well-known fact that it's usually women who take care of sick relatives. And again, when they do that, they lose opportunities to do other things. And when you don't have reliable and clean water, you get sick. Most important thing I want to mention is how critical water is in schools. School wash should be one of the most important activity in development along with girl education. I personally visited several places. 2 years ago, I was in Zambia. If in a school, first you build latrines and you build wash station, the impact on the retention of adolescent girl in those schools, that's like within 6 months, you multiply it by 3 or 4. And we all know, I mean, I'm a water engineer, but most of you are population specialists. You know what it means to keeping adolescent girls in school and how critical that is. I mean, it's like the most important thing in development. So, and it all starts with basically having wash stations. I should also mention that this also applies to women teachers, because same thing with women teachers. If you don't have a wash station, well, 1 week a month, they don't come to teach. And at some point, they may even lose their job. At the end of the day, water security and water use, it's about water users and it's about practices. I usually joke with fellow water engineers that the problem with water is basically the people. If they didn't touch the water, if they didn't use it, we could manage it very well. What some engineers reply to me, say, can we remove the people? I said, no, you have to work with them. And that's also an issue for many engineers, to work with people. But at the end of the day, it's about practices. People, because they are ignorant and because they just need to survive, they tend to have water use practices that are often wasteful and polluting. So it's a matter of, I think Franklin mentioned that, it's a matter of behavior change. We need to teach farmers, for example, how to better use water. This is a picture I took in Beirut. I also spent some time in other countries in the Middle East. Just down my building, this gentleman could take about 3 minutes with a broom to clean the yard, but it's less tiring to use a hose, so he spends about half an hour with the hose, gently pushing the leaves. And I don't know how many liters he's using, but that's definitely a behavior that has to change, okay? Same thing in Cairo with all the guards. Every morning they wash the cars of people who have nice cars, okay? Well, they don't do it with a bucket and a sponge. They also do it with a hose. And liters of water go away. So that's a quick overview of water security and how it's impacted by population growth. Last thing I want to mention is that the Sustainable Water Partnership, we have a website, swpwater.org, and we have a series of toolkits where we explain, it's not rocket science, we just compile best practices. We explain through that series of toolkit what improving water security is about. I'm not going to go through the details. I will refer you to our website, and I'll take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. If there's one thing that I've learned over 15 years of working here on multi-sectoral issues is that for water people, everything is water. And as you said, increasingly now for non-water people, people are realizing that everything is water. I really like the chain you made between the water crisis to the food crisis to the livelihood crisis to the migration crisis to the social crisis to the security crisis. And I think that's a chain that we all of us work at some point along that. So understanding, that its roots in water is critical. And thanks for mentioning disasters as well. And that's a great segue into our next speaker, Zeba Sathar, who's going to tell us a little bit about experience, Population Council's experience working in Pakistan after a series of natural disasters there. Zeba.
Thank you very much, Megan, for including me in this wonderful panel. I think it's largely a conversation to work on water issues, food issues,
States has
issues, where which is largely absent. So glad the Woodrow. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So glad that the Woodrow was focusing. I just want to, if in my slides, because I hear the screen.
Yes.
They focus on the second slide. Resilience. Realizing that there's very little, when we started this work in Pakistan and course work we've been doing, we found that there's very little cross-disciplinary work. That's why the Population Council has taken resilience research priority set up here. And the idea is really to address some of the data gaps, research gaps, and look at resilience and the adaptive capacity of the most vulnerable to environmental shocks, including, of course, those climate change. So if I can switch to the third slide, I feel that we have to do this because really in terms of using geospatial analysis, visualize, yes, to visualize our environmental shock and stresses and overlay them with population data so that we can determine both risks and, of course, impact. We also have expertise in terms of methods, in terms of behavioral and social science. This is turned to. I think our main experience in terms of identifying, targeting the most vulnerable populations, such as girl programming for adolescent girls, which is also mentioned by the girl. But I think most of all, that you have the advantage of the local knowledge of the country context important because I don't think there is a one answer. First of all, the range of climate disasters really vary. And I think the responses vary. Text. This is what I really want to emphasize the talk today. So I don't. Whereas I think some things are generalizable in each country or specific setting. So glad that the community response as earlier. In terms of geographic scope, we are looking at a range of countries. Done work in Guatemala, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Pakistan, here, and ask different questions. Are you changing the slides? Are we on slide 4?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So I'm going to talk to you about work we're doing in Pakistan. So as most of the room would know, this is, I would say, slide 5, which shows Pakistan's population and plan. Recently had a census was with great shock and awe that found that were even more than anticipated based on earlier projections. Came up to 208 million. Our growth rate at 4% per annum, essentially, slide 6, the 2.4% per annum was much higher than what had been projected for we were 2.8. Our contraceptive rate, we have been with the DHS and fact results, but the last DHS were only at 35. We had as high an But I did want to point out the most vulnerable, the hardest to reach, have the highest need. So I think Pakistan provides excellent research ground for looking at aspects of. We also happen to be the seventh highest in terms of the global index risk, and we have that growing fast, young population with, as I said, so went about our task, looking at what we might really consider as highest risk land. We came across after a lot of research that the 2010 flood were probably the most unfortunate, memorable, and bad drastic way. They're imprinted in everyone's Pakistan and Africa because 20 million people were affected by the Pakistan. There were huge economic losses, but there were as thousands dead recorded. And the floods were just followed with very dramatic every year with the monsoon, founded with glacier, Pakistan right short. So all of Pakistan, the side 7 was affected, right starting from Gilgit Baltistan right down to Karachi and right down to the Arabian Sea. So and many of the districts, one third of were affected. Those study on next and was selected for Punjab. It was the average sort of district of this province, kind of smack in the middle of that. Started what could really construct in terms of who are the affected, what the levels of vulnerability, what are the demographic data that obviously didn't have the resources to but secondary data and make associations with graphic images and the flood. So and look at draw implications. Punjab used a lot of videos. He found very nice. So one of these is slide is a map. Shows you actually how the flood. I mean, 2008. That's most. There's hardly. I mean, you have the river Indus running valley, but when the floods happen, living what a large and the third map actually the flood. But Mianwali was sort of study what might in the long term effects that think about. It is one of the most diverse, one of the poorest districts, but above all, it provided us of natural design because it Tehsils are sub-districts, but had about the same area of water coverage, but in one Tehsil, it had 99% of the population was affected. So it provides a nice comparison of a severely affected field by the floods, moderately affected, which is Mianwali, Pipla, which is. I want you to remember all these names because they'll come up. So next, we looked at the mix found that we had data for 2008, 2011. We could construct a before and after association data provided at the Tehsil level, unusual parts. Get that. So we compared what was happening in the province of Punjab and we put them in the Mianwali district overall, and then the rightmost other three things which I want to focus on. Now, I know that most studies of responses to calamities depict this response, whereas if you have a rural, that people will send agricultural land, sell livestock, they need the money they have, and this is seen very clearly in our data for Mianwali. Next, please. We saw that this picture that we're not showing in this one, but from other data that together that there are strong hints of migration within the district. There is concrete evidence almost doubling in the remittances in Tehsils and increasing move of people, particularly from the more urbanized areas of Tehsils. So this is the kind of migration appears to be not. It is a long-term response, obviously, and like Mianwali, but also short-term response after. The next, we did want to, we intend to focus on women for this study, but we quite to our surprise that there was a real jump up, a doubling of female labor force participation rate just after the floods. And given that Pakistan traditionally has a very low female labor force participation rate, and that Mianwali is a very conventional, conservative sort of setting where women don't step too much out of the home. Albeit the fact that they did enter mostly in agricultural professions, but agricultural occupations and filling the shoes of men who had migrated. It was a surprising finding for us. And even though the labor force participation is limited, we do think that we're not quite sure whether empowering, this is the type of further, but just the fact that women were forced to be more mobile and have homes was major. Next, please. We also, to our surprise, really dramatic happen in terms of household size. A combination possibly of my, but Issa failed again. Tehsil, which was, as I said, almost 100% of the population, experienced a dip in household size of more than one person. Could be migration related. But what we noticed was it's really a decline mainly for children under 5, which again we want to look at. But if you just look at comparison with the province of Punjab, you would change or with size, but you see households in after the immediate as a short-term rain floods in Mianwali. And we would have probably said the data errors, etc., except I think the most exciting of evidence that we came up with was in the next slide. Was when we were actually able to come up with sector 2008 11. We found that Isafel, as I said, backward Tehsil, backward had a sharp hike in its contraceptive. Included the other Tehsils, but it seems that it may be a temporary thing, but certainly is much more than one would have expected. It's notable enough to something to investigate further, and we think it is related very much to info. People did really market this Sahel for UNFPA went there, WHO group went there, all the clusters, the health clusters, aftermath of the floods. There was emergency health services, for women. So we think these women who were traditionally not exposed to was certainly and probably had unmet, did actually. And on the right hand side, found that we're not picking up that. What we did was we looked at all the districts and classified them as those that were severely affected by the floods, moderately affected, and not affected at all. And interestingly found a repetition of that trend. So at least find, we're quite sure that we're on something important. So we start by saying that find unexpectedly that I think that and I found similar evidence from what we call internally displaced people, people who, because of the war on terror in Pata, northernmost Pakistan, have been displaced. Really, that women are forced in a way to become more mobile, or at least to give up parda because not to observe as strict parda because not they're in a camp setting or. Now, this can also lead to high risk for women vulnerable to the violence and exposure and other harm. But it has a positive side to it. And it seems to be associated with behavior and family planning use and even greater maternal health care. I haven't shown the slide on a real hike in delivery-related nutritional care. So they being exposed to youth services seem to be able to absorb new changes in behavior, etc., which do last even when the internally displaced persons back, families back. Greater involvement in economic work, even if it's agricultural work, can be not very empowering to change. And we also found evidence that people were living more in nuclear families rather than extended, so that has an impact. Also. In terms of resilience, it's like is really that whereas in this case, it's like a response to a disaster that prepare for future floods, they will happen. There are 2 or 3 years usually when there aren't floods, that can be planning because there is high unemployment, especially among people, that this would be a good part of that, rather than just going and building structure and preparing for the floods in this way. I think that migration to urban settlement may be a longer term trend, but I think that it is in some sort of skills on and better education that would. And by the way, we also found evidence of greater of secondary education, boys, so overall, I think the resilient behavior that we saw outweighed the negatives in terms of better housing and the part of women getting better reproductive health. So, as I said, vulnerability. We feel that more research is required from our findings. But I did want to refer and link my talk and my findings just as I did to previous speaker that whereas we've been arguing for family planning services because of high unmet need, pregnancy, etc. in Pakistan, it's very recently when Pakistan has entered water status of being really water scarce, and people are really feeling the issues, the aftermath of water scarcity, not the floods, but water scarcity that's brought the population issue to the table really over the last couple of months. As we lead up to the election, we are going to so it's ironic, but it's the abundance of water that's happening, but rather shortage of water that's bringing home the crisis of shortage population. And I'll stop here.
Well, thank you. That was a tremendous deep dive into a really important case study that shows some of the potential silver linings in the cloud there of this terrible disaster. Zeba, I understand you might have to go because of the call to prayer. Would you be able to take a question now? Do you have time?
No, yes, that's fine. Actually, the call to prayer I thought would be it would be quite loud for the Skype call, but it's over.
Oh, okay, great. That's great. Can you stay on the line then for a little while? Oh, okay, great. Well, then we'll actually go to Jason now, and then we'll come back and take questions all at once. Thank you, and thanks for coming in from so far away. We really appreciate it, and it's wonderful to be able to bring in that perspective.
Okay, thanks, Megan, for inviting me to speak today, and just a general thanks to the Wilson Center and to USAID, who for a long time have supported these conversations. 2018 now, so my first visit to the Wilson Center was 20 years ago. In 1998, I started a population environment fellowship, which was part of USAID's developmental assistance on family planning, and it trained professionals like myself and others in the room who've explored these connections for a long time. So it's kind of fun to come back. They've sort of put my nose to the grindstone on crunching numbers, so I haven't had a chance to talk that much about population health and environment and development in a while. So it's nice to come and learn some new things as well, even from colleagues like Zeba, who I see all the time and talk to, and I didn't even know was doing research on population, climate change, and resilience. So always fun to come back and to learn something new. Family planning might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you contemplate environmental change and resilience. But I think that previous speakers have shown how intimately these things are bound together. And today's population growth and movement, as Zeba has talked about, and I'll talk a little further about, really are shaped by large-scale and long-term demographic trends that are taking place across the globe, at a country level, within countries, and we see extreme variability across different countries. So I think that when it comes down to family planning, these large-scale demographic trends, they're really driven by individual choices, and that's the important thing to remember. We can talk about population, but population is really, it's just a symptom. In fact, it's a symptom of reproductive rights, and the reproductive rights of women and girls, particularly the right to decide whether, when, and how many children to have. These are profoundly linked to the demographic trends that we have seen and talked about in the Sahel and in Pakistan. So fulfilling these rights, including family planning, will be critical in determining how we navigate our global challenges, how we navigate our way to Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, and as I'll show in some, or talk about in some demographic trends, certainly long past 2030. So, I think we've heard about the population, environment, development, and security links, and I'll just talk a little bit more about where I think family planning fits into that and where Family Planning 2020 fits into that. FP 2020, or Family Planning 2020, was developed as a global partnership to meet this challenge of reproductive rights and to mobilize the energy, the partners, and the resources needed to accelerate progress and bend the curve in meeting reproductive rights, and particularly a growth in modern contraceptive use. So our focus is on 69 of the poorest countries, and now approximately, more than 40 of those countries have made a commitment to the FP 2020 partnership and committed to accelerating progress, not in just in meeting needs, but meeting needs and choice with various methods. So providing one method is not really meeting reproductive rights, and meeting those needs with quality services. So it's more than just having a method available and consistently available, but having a range of methods available, having those methods meet the social norms of that community, and have those needs met with quality services. So I think we can look more deeply into any number of these poorest countries, and Zeba has been very active in the Family Planning 2020 partnership in Pakistan, but we can look at any number of these countries to understand the interconnectedness of the issues that we're discussing today. We heard about the Sahel, we heard about Pakistan. How about I just take a little glimpse into Nigeria? for example, to illustrate some of these changes. Nigeria is Africa's most populous country and largest economy. Like to do quizzes? Anybody know Nigeria's population today? Nice round number, just about 200 million, thank you. And Nigeria has not experienced the fertility decline of many other Anglophone African countries, and it's increasingly being left behind by some of its Sahelian neighbors who are actually making progress on providing increased access to contraceptive methods and are starting to see slight fertility declines. Today in Nigeria, 40% of the population is under the age of 15, so 40%. And the population of women and girls, or women of reproductive age, so the population 15 to 49, that population increases by 1 million women and girls each year. So just keeping a steady state, a steady level of contraceptive prevalence, if you are trying to meet the needs of an increasing population, requires you to grow your program. There are more and more women of reproductive age. If you want to keep the percentage of those who are using a method the same, then you need to expand your services. So that has a cost. But FP 2020 isn't really about staying the same and keeping at pace, but about bending the curve. So bending the curve means not just keeping up, it means moving ahead. And so that really is a challenge for Nigeria as they invest in healthcare programs. So what's the impact of that? I mean, I think we've heard about some of the impacts of population growth, but the impact of that on Nigeria is in displacement, in movement, in conflict. And last year, interestingly enough, Nigeria was actually the leading origin country for migration to Italy. So it replaced some of the conflict origin areas of the Middle East as there was some pressure to slow down migration from Syria and Iraq through Turkey, through Greece and across to Italy. Nigeria actually became the leading origin country. 38,000 Nigerians entering Italy in, this was actually end of 2016 data. I don't have the 2017 data on hand. And this was in part due to the push factors that we have heard about today. We often hear about Boko Haram and the unsettled and instability of northern Nigeria, but less often making headlines are the slower acting drought and crises across the Lake Chad Basin, which is really a water challenge, but combines together with a demographic challenge, a security challenge. And together, the Boko Haram conflicts, the Lake Chad drought, displace millions of people, somewhere between 5 and 10 million people displaced within Nigeria just from those regions. So I mentioned that there are 200 million people living in Nigeria, or actually, gentleman to the right here mentioned 200 million. How about Nigeria's population projection to 2050? 273, not even close. So 400. So 400 million. So I don't know how much we want to get in demographic projections, but our medium projection assumes continued fertility decline. Well, Nigeria's fertility hasn't declined much, but we have a relatively optimistic scenario for fertility decline factored into our projections for Nigeria. And under a relatively optimistic scenario, Nigeria, because of the large percentage of population that's under 15, those people just entering into their reproductive years, even if a growing percentage start to use modern methods of contraception, Nigeria will be up to 400 million in my lifetime. I hope to live to 2050, and certainly in the lifetime of most of the Nigerians who are that 40% under 15. So what are the prospects in Nigeria? And what does that mean for water? What does that mean for food? So, I mean, agriculture is a good case. Agriculture, Nigeria is largely subsistence agriculture. And what it means at an individual level, so let's just take this from the global down to the individual. It means that that family farm, with an average of 5 children per family, maybe half of whom are men, will have to be, or boys, will have to be divided. So if they're struggling with the plot of land they have now, you're cutting it in half. So it's a real challenge. And this division of agriculture, or this parcelization, is evidenced across much of Africa, where the hectares per family farmed has declined over time as you've had to slice up these smaller and smaller parcels of land. So, I like to talk about the global side of demographics, but then really, I think what we heard from Zeba's talk is that when we talk about family planning, yeah, it has an impact on demographics, but really more importantly, it has an impact on individuals. And really, family planning is so intimately linked to educational outcomes, to women's workforce participation. And I'm not a resilience expert, but most resilience experts, when looking at resilience of the household, adaptive capacity, transformative capacity, look at the role of women in the household, in the adaptive capacity, and look at factors related to the education, their education level, which is related to their ability to uptake new agricultural techniques or to diversify their income. So it's related to that workforce participation. Family planning, certainly linked to female education, certainly linked to women's workforce participation. But rarely, at least approximately 3 years ago, rarely were we finding research that had made those links explicitly from family planning to resilience, even though that tangentially the links were all there, but it really hadn't been researched. So, through leadership of USAID with funding to Population Reference Bureau to Population Council, I really am proud to see the work blossoming in this field. I don't think those folks were really able to participate today, unfortunately, but I think that there's a great amount of research emerging on family planning as a transformative, and frankly, use that word, transformative approach to building resilience, because it is about transforming the lives of women and girls, their families. It affects communities, as you noted. And I think if you look towards Population Council and PRB's work on this connection, you'll find some, I think, really interesting and emerging pieces of work. That said, coming down to the challenge of family planning and bringing it back to the global, the reality is that we really haven't bent the curve to the level that we had hoped when we started the FP 2020 partnership in 2012. And while there are more contraceptive users across the 69 countries today than there would have been under historic growth, we have a long, long way to go to our 2020 goal, and certainly to our 2030 goals of universal access. And I just want to really focus on this, what we call S-curve pattern of contraceptive prevalence growth, okay? And what you'll see here is across those 69 countries, there's a pattern of growth that we tend to see, with countries with very low modern contraceptive prevalence on that left side, that will tend to have low prevalence for a long time. They have slow growth, and you don't see much changing in those countries. Countries can enter into a period of growth, investment. There's a greater desire to start to space and limit births. And we see this opportunity period where growth can happen very quickly. And then we see countries start to enter into a high prevalence growth rate where they really don't grow very fast because prevalence gets to pretty high levels. And there you always going to expect that there are women who aren't using contraception because they want to get pregnant for various reasons. In fact, in some countries we're finding because of migration, husbands are away and women say, I don't need to use a contraceptive method. But look at that lowest group. Really focus on that lowest group. Somalia, South Sudan, Chad, Guinea, Gambia, Eritrea, Congo, Nigeria, Sudan, Mali, Benin, Central Africa Republic, and Niger. These countries depict many of the interrelated challenges that the prior speakers talked about. Security, environmental risk, all intermixed in these countries. These are our countries that are growing very slowly. Niger has actually started to move into the next category, Benin as well. But these are the areas where it's really critical that we understand these interlinked challenges and we find new ways of doing business. Because business as usual, standard family planning programs are standard efforts of reaching communities with water and environmental initiatives are going to be further stressed. And they're working in often conflict settings. And business as usual in terms of spending, this is the amount of money spent on family planning since 2012. No laser there, but you can see the bar. 2012, when we started the FP 2020 partnership, about $1 billion was being spent by donors on family planning. There was an upsurge in donor spending and assistance from those governments for family planning, but that has largely leveled off. And these last 2 years, you'll see just through 2016, so unaffected by any global politics of around administration changes. This is the past. We could talk about 2017 and 2018 in the future. But really, we aren't spending the amount needed to reach those millions of women who have an unmet need. Just to say that it's not just donors who are stepping up to meet this need or who need to step up to meet this need. It is domestic governments who are a large portion of the spending that goes on for family planning, as well as individuals themselves. So if donors aren't able to spend more, and we do want to just even stay where we are, then country governments will have to step up or pockets will be stretched. And the pockets among the poorest don't have very far to stretch. So where will that come from? I think our challenge as those folks who are considering these interconnected issues is to struggle with the trade-offs of investment. I can come to you and say, you should spend on family planning. But Eric's going to come to you and say, we need to spend on water. And if IFPRI were here, they would talk to you about our need to spend on agricultural extension and improving the prospects for food. And that's how development works. But these challenges aren't going to be overcome by that mentality. I mean, I think Africa is an example of trying to address these things together. But probably your resources come from individual pots and you figure out ways to piece them together. And until we find different ways of doing business, then we will continue to see interconnectedness as innovation instead of interconnectedness as being the way we should do business. $25 billion was spent in 2016 on humanitarian assistance. $1 billion on family planning assistance. These are the trade-offs. I mean, this is our challenge. Those of us who are working in development have to come to terms with a different way. If Roger Mark was here, I know that he would have already said that this is our challenge, and he has challenged us. But let's find ways to step up to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for that call to action. And I know Roger Mark would definitely have appreciated that approach that to the trade-offs and to really understanding that at root we may all understand how they're connected, but until we change, as you said, the way we do business, it's going to be challenged to bend the curve, not just at the global level, but as you said, at the individual level, and really help the people that we want to help. So I have a ton of questions, but now it is time for yours. I would love to hear from you, and I know our speakers would want to answer any questions that you have. Please wait for my colleagues with a microphone before you ask your question, and introduce yourself and give your affiliation. And if you're going to direct your question to one speaker, please let us know. Or if it's for everyone, we'll give everyone a chance to answer it. So who has the first question? Right there in the back.
Hello, my name is Natalie, and I'm interning with FEMA this summer. So this is probably more for Jason, but anyone can jump in. How do we balance expanding contraceptive access to help curb overall population growth and conserve resources on the planet while also needing to increase birth rates in developed nations like Japan and Italy in order to avoid economic downturn and maintain replacement level birth rates?
Great, let's take one more. I'll take a couple at a time. Does somebody else have another one they want to put in? Okay, all the way at the front.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Mark Hathaway with Japigo. And I have a question that could be for any of you. How do you deal with leaders in countries where talking about population growth is not so politically savvy, and especially in more vulnerable populations and lower resource settings?
Great. Okay, let's take those two together. And Jason, do you want to start with the first one?
Thanks for your question about birth rates. Well, I think there's a bit of a debate on whether or not actually a low birth rate is a real problem. And so there are certainly some policies that have been enacted in countries in Europe, and most recently in China. They were talking about a complete removal of even the updated demographic policy to completely eliminate any suggestions of child limits. And so there are no examples where any of those policies have actually led to an increase in birth rates. So these are individual choices. People look at the economics, and women in particular look at the challenges of a work environment and children, and they make choices. And in many of those countries now, there are fewer than 2 children per woman. That is something, if you can't bend that curve, what are the prospects economically? Well, a lot of people argue that migration is sort of the critical piece of this, and that if we were to facilitate migration, then there are no challenges for the economics of labor. And so, I would argue that the prospects of growth are more important, and they're more important to address than the long-term possibilities of decline. Because really, across the globe, what we're looking at is a growing and rapidly growing population through actually 2050, or even if you look further, if you want to go further, we can talk to 2100. We are going to grow. And where those people go, that's political choices across borders within countries.
Thank you. Franklin or Zeba, do you want to address the issue of working with different political environments, different countries?
Well, I
would like
Go ahead, Zeba.
Zeba,
Go.
you go first.
I work, and have been for the last couple of decades working in an environment where it's not that political leaders are averse to hearing about population issues, but just really they don't regard them as a priority area. And I was, I think one of the links to be made, we've already made the links with health. So I think that's an important that wasn't made maybe well enough earlier in Pakistan. But here I see an opportunity to link, make the link with climate change as one of the major parts of the SDG agenda that Pakistani leaders are focusing on. They are concerned about water issues. They are concerned about climate disasters, etc. So we'll use whatever we can. But I think generally politicians suffer from a very myopic time frame, thinking about the 3 to 5 years that in office, and don't think of the beyond. I think for the first time in Pakistan, the population issue is sort of coming up really in their faces, and we're hoping that they will respond to it much more. But I would say that it's not a question of, it's just a low priority. The other thing where I know the African Union has been particularly successful in raising these concerns, maybe with the slight exception of Nigeria, but even Nigeria, is really linking, the reduction of fertility and favorable birth spacing patterns, etc., with the demographic dividend. And I think that has been a nice peg, linking it with positive development outcomes. That has worked quite an extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Franklin?
I would just pick up Zeba's last point, that I think that we feel that we have had more success when we talk about child spacing than when we talk about when we attack this in any other manner. And one of the things that the discussion of child spacing is able to do is to make communities understand that it's important for the health of the mother, and it's also important for the health of the children. And that child spacing, particularly in rural settings, can really get ingrained in people when they come to a greater understanding.
Great, thank you. And then Jason, of course, FP 2020 works with a wide range of country governments. If you have something to say about how you address that challenge.
I think increasingly I find it not to be a challenge. I think we have more challenges talking about population and its link to the environment in a European setting than we do in talking to country governments. I think most leaders, they understand
They're beginning.
they understand the challenge. They've watched their cities grow. They have watched their populations grow. I mean, if these political leaders are in their 50s, the population of those countries has doubled or tripled in their lifetimes. So they get it. I think the bigger question, and Franklin speaks to this, is how to prioritize the response, which is it okay to talk about contraception? And in that space, yeah, child spacing in West Africa has been far more successful, but it may only take us so far before people have spaced adequately their births, and still fertility remains high because they still start very early and they end very late. And you can space out 5 births over that lifetime. So, increasingly what we're finding is it's not so much the challenge of talking about this. It's what do we do, and how do we do more of it? And I know Japaigo is at the forefront of how do we do more of it and introducing newer and better technologies to do so. So I think there are some spaces where there's still challenges, and I think as countries decentralize, then we start to get into some interesting challenges, because in some countries, demographics drive dollars. And so while at a national level, they may be very cognizant of the issues, if counties or states, as in the Nigeria context, are making decisions based on demographics, well, then it's not in the political leaders' interest to focus on this. And so that is a space where we're sort of actively trying to work with decentralizations or decentralized settings to make the case in smaller and smaller governments where that spending has to happen. Pakistan's a good case of that, where provinces are really starting to lead the charge, but there's a lot of differences across those provinces.
Eric, do you want to add anything?
Sure, yeah. I think most leaders around the world, they understand that population growth, especially in its impact on water, at the end of the day, it's about political stability. But it's true that sometimes there are political calculations. I mean, I lived recently in Ethiopia where the central government, they realized that they have a population growth issue. I mean, it's like Nigeria. They went from 30 million to 100 million in 30 years, and now it's in another 30 years, it will be 150 million. And the government is seriously wondering, how are we going to keep all these people busy? Because at the end of the day, all those young people, they need livelihoods. So they are wondering about it. But at the same time, you can still have an old mentality. Ethiopia is a very ethnical country. You have different ethnies that are jockeying for power. And in some regions, you have local leaders who are openly pushing for population growth because their thinking is in 50 years, if my ethnic is the biggest population-wise, then I'll be in charge, me or my kids, they will be in charge of the country. So we still have that old-fashioned mentality that sometimes exists in some places. But I mean, there is a saying that if people will lead, leaders will follow. What I mean by that is that it's again about behavior change. I think people realize more and more what population growth is about, its impact on all resources, starting with water. If I take the example of India, in India, like in many other countries, you used to have politicians being elected with a slogan, among others, of free water. Vote for me and I'll give you water for free. I think in India nowadays, most people would say, well, I'd rather pay because I'm not going to get water. I mean, you told me that 20 years ago that I'll have water for free. I'm still waiting. And I'm paying a lot of money to get water from a water truck, from a private vendor. So I'd rather pay to get the service. I think the mentalities are changing. And yeah, even if leaders are looking at a short time span, with behavior change of populations, leaders will have to address those issues more and more.
Up here in the front.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I'm an ex-World Banker, and I'm also Japanese. And I want to just one comment about the many people have concerns that Japan's population is declining and the government is worried and so forth. But let me say that when I was a child, the population back in the 50s they had many, many kids. And the concern of Japan at that time was how to reduce the population growth and how to achieve longer life. Now, 50 years later, Japan has achieved both. And it's time for Japan to enjoy it and to show the rest of the world how to do it and how to do it going forward. I don't think we should be distracted about the potential. The one issue is, of course, governments, bureaucracies don't like it because that means they may have to downsize. When villages disappear, the bureaucracy disappears also. And that's a tragedy for bureaucracies, but not for the population as a whole. So should we keep our eyes focused on what to do about Nigeria when it becomes 400 million? Because it doesn't stop there. It will go to 800 million. You see, and that's the truth about Pakistan. With all the studies and all the bright people I have around me at the World Bank, they seem to keep on increasing, and Bangladesh is perhaps the worst case. So let's focus on that, and may I request that we keep on doing that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Right to where down, Kara?
Thank you very much for these really interesting and dynamic talks. I'm from Pathfinder International, and I work on population health environment issues. I often hear people talking, and I felt myself even thinking this as each of you were speaking about equity issues. I mean, and also, Eric, you were talking about what I would call thresholds, which is a really important conversation that we haven't talked that much about today, or very explicitly. And I just want, maybe any of you could react to this. I think I'd be particularly interested in hearing Zeba in Pakistan, or in reference to specific countries maybe, or different entities that invest and how we persuade them. What do we say, we who are very interested in investments being put into family planning or into integrated programming, what do we say and how do we frame our arguments to be effective in today's world when we are given the response about population growth, that it's really about equitable distribution of land, of water, and it's not so much about growth? How do we respond?
Thank you, Kara. That's a big question. Let's give everyone a chance. We'll start with Zeba.
I think that you're on, absolutely spot on. I think it has to be, you just can't come in out of the blue and just say, well, we need fewer numbers. I think it has to be based on equity argument. I think in the case of very specific Pakistan, I think we're really now focusing, especially with the new government coming in, the idea that basically it's the poorest of the poor that are having the highest unwanted fertility. If delivery care has shot up as it has, it's really the richest for private healthcare who are able to take care of their reproductive, as is the case in family planning. So I think for me, the biggest really piece of evidence that I keep using is really the Countdown series showed that in the case of the MDGs, I mean, it was the only countries that really addressed equity issue, equity across the income quintiles in terms of services and access, that were able to achieve their MDGs. Those who just focused on it, going into it cold without looking at different income groups and their needs. So I think focusing on the poorest of the poor and making sure public services are available for them, both for delivery care and particularly for family planning, and that should be part of the essential service package, is how we're trying to really sell it, because otherwise, I think it would lead to an increase in poverty and all the adverse outcomes.
Thank you. Franklin, you want to
Well,
answer that?
I would say two things. That one is that as one looks at a desire for equitable distribution of goods and services, that there are some cases that very much support the idea of family planning. When we talk about politicians and how politicians react to this, here's the interesting thing that I think is taking place, particularly among younger politicians. Younger politicians are very much moving to the fact that in their countries, there should be universal and free education. And as they look at those education bills, they clearly are affected and shocked by the change in education bill just because of the change in the number of students. And for many young politicians, if there's anything that I've seen that has affected their thoughts on this, it has been that fact that educational systems are already strained, that if we want to move to universal education, then we really have to figure out how many kids are we educating. And as we see that number going up, there's a reaction to that that has helped them to support family planning.
Thank you. Jason?
I think I just want to echo Franklin's comments. There are any number of tools that have been around for a long time. The Health Policy Project, funded by USAID for years and years, has been working on what's called rapid model. It looks at resources around population and development in countries, and it does just that. It takes projections, demographic projections. It ties them to different education scenarios, and I think usually the just keeping pace scenario alarms people. Right. But then the equitable distribution of resources is sort of that next step. I think everybody agrees in the conceptually to the SDGs, but the investment required to achieve that, moving beyond just the MDG universal primary education. If we agree that that's not enough, then the scenarios of more equitable distribution of education resources, land, whatever we look at, are just made harder and harder. So I think there are some interesting new tools coming out, sort of moving beyond that rapid analysis. The Health Policy Project is coming up with an SDG model that ties different SDG outcomes to demographic scenarios and looks at how much would it cost, or what would be the benefits of investing in family planning as a pathway towards various SDGs. I think they look at 9 or 10. Clive, I think you've reviewed this too, so you might know. So a new tool coming out using the goals of today. It's been, I think, test run in Malawi, and I encourage you to look at that as a sort of new way of making an old argument.
Thank you. Eric, any thoughts on equitable distribution?
Yeah, when we talk about water scarcity, very often it is said that it's not an issue of physical scarcity, it's an issue of governance scarcity. And it's true that if you look at the issue about water management, in many places it's about inequitable distribution and allocation of water. Many big cities around the world in developing countries, you have the center of the city that is more or less supplied with drinking water. And then the slum cities around, they don't have water, or it's very unreliable. They have to pay, as I said, private vendors, or they usually pay much more than the center of the city to get water that is not respecting the same standards. Interestingly enough, you find the same thing in agriculture, in irrigation. If you look at everywhere in the world, including Pakistan, I worked recently in Pakistan too, you always have the same pattern where upstream farmers are going to get more water and downstream farmers will get less water. Usually upstream farmers, again, behavior change is needed. They tend to over-irrigate. They don't necessarily think of other people. Water, there's also the issue of pricing water, and they waste it. And then the water doesn't reach the downstream of the canal where you usually have, well, the poor families, the poor farmers, the marginalized population, and they don't get enough water. Same thing with access of women to water, not just for drinking, but in Africa. There is very often a great opportunity for women to use water, for example, for gardening or poultry farming. And you don't need a lot of water to do that, but it's a fantastic way to build the resilience of households by diversifying their economic activities. But it's again an issue of access to water, physical access, management access, the right to access the water, again, the right of women to be part of the decision-making processes. So yeah, inequity is definitely something we need to address.
Great, thank you all. Back here.
Hi, my name's Lacey, and I'm an MPA graduate student. My question is more specifically for Eric. And so on that note, we saw this year the day zero water crisis in South Africa in a major city. And that was even after, the citizens had been told for months to limit your water. So I am just curious if your organization has looked at that situation because, citizens finally got the message because their water ran out. Are any policies, being looked at in light of what happened? Because, with the human element, policies usually help change our behavior. And so that was my question.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting example. Cape Town, it's a typical example of politics being reactive and not proactive. Cape Town, yes, people learned the hard way that they had to do something. What I find mostly interesting about Cape Town is that Cape Town is kind of a modern African city, so there was a lot of talk about Cape Town. But the situation of Cape Town, there are plenty of other African cities that's routinely what's going on. If you go to Lagos or any other big African capital, you have millions of people in some cities who don't have access to water, who have to be careful with what they do. You have women and girls spending hours not just walking to the water points, but lining up at the water point to fill their jerry cans and then carrying the jerry can back. It's routine. Now, Cape Town, South Africa being a more developed part of Africa, Cape Town is a modern city with a big white population. So a lot was said about it and the swimming pools, etc. Suddenly people realized what the reality of life and water is. But this is happening all over Africa, and we don't talk enough about it. That's what's sad. The other interesting thing about Cape Town, and again, it's being lack of being proactive versus being reactive. Cape Town, the situation was and it's also a point I want to make about the engineering approach. Cape Town, most of the water came from dams. You know, if you ask an engineer a solution to a problem, an engineer knows how to design and build. That's his toolkit or her toolkit. That's all. Design and build, nothing else. So in Cape Town, they had dams. Well, the rain didn't come. So the reservoir didn't fill up, so there's no water. But Cape Town is on the coast. They could have thought before about desalination, but it's more expensive than building dams. It's a bit more complicated, so they didn't think about that. So there was behavior change, recycling water, reusing water. All this was not on the table. Now it's on the table in Cape Town. Yes, they are talking about desalination. They are talking about reusing water, recycling, and so on and so forth. But maybe they should have thought of that before. I mean, that's no. And the point I want to make about the package of solution around addressing water, delivering water to increasing populations, is that like any capacity building and resilience building exercise, you have to have a flexibility and a range of solutions. Your toolkit has to be diverse. So behavior change is one thing. Institutional and management improvements is another thing. Infrastructure, when you think about infrastructure, you have to think about gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. And again, it's really a big behavior change, not just for people, but for decision makers. And most water managers around the world are still today civil engineers who have a very simple toolkit, and there's a lot to be done to change their thinking and have them think in a more diversified manner in terms of solutions.
Thank you. And Eric participated in a podcast that we have on New Security Beat about Cape Town and Day Zero with some other experts. If you're interested, there's more there. Let's take this question up in the front, and then we'll take one or two more. We're going to get all of them in.
Hello, thank you. My name is Tenzing. I'm actually born and raised in Nepal in India. And I'm glad I came here. It was very interesting, the talk. But so I grew up in Nepal, in Kathmandu, and I watched the population growth after the royal family massacre, and it was crazy. Now property is so expensive at Kathmandu, the central capital. And I grew up in India in a boarding school built by the colonists. So and it's like one of the best boarding schools, they say. But yet, within these spaces, like even if you have the best, you're privileged, you still don't have spaces to talk about birth control or things like that, abortion. The education is very, I would say, it's not engaging of dialogue, and it's not. I feel like as in there are no spaces to talk about such things, even in prestigious boarding schools, even India and Nepal, and so like. We don't, as the youth, like, and these schools have like ministers, kids, and all of people who can actually make change and impact, but yet there's no conversation. Why is there, like, I see there's no improvement in those education systems? Like, we are talking about a lot of things, but not bringing the topic to the youth that are in classes, making it a curriculum for them. Because I think education in India and Nepal is great, but there's always need for improvement. I think a lot of things I did learn in school, like, I've forgotten majority of them, but I have not like had discussions or conversations as such. And for me to have such discussions, I'm here abroad. A lot of my friends still don't have the discussions back in India or in Nepal where they actually need it. So would you what is your thoughts about that? And would you think it's better to now target education systems there, or be like have curriculum that is more just not.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. Anybody back? All right, let's talk about that. How do we create more spaces for dialogue, particularly with youth in the countries where we're working? And Wilson Center we're very lucky to have this forum for dialogue here, but that's not always the case in many places. Zeba, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think India and Nepal must be very similar to Pakistan. We have a proliferation of media, the mass media. I think that we can use that much more, and it is being used much more for more open conversations. But specifically, more private conversations could take place using social media platforms. I think that's happening a lot. Using mobile phones and blogs, etc. So. Using the traditional educational system and really making changes in that, I would agree, is more difficult. But using the more informal, as I said, social media platforms and youth networks is proving to be much more successful. Getting things into the curriculum, get religious leaders involved, you get the bureaucracy, which already got a beating by various people. But I think that youth are finding their own way, to get information. Of course, some are luckier than others. They own mobile phones. They're well connected. But I think mobile phones have certainly been a breakthrough in Pakistan in getting private.
Great. Thank you. Franklin?
I guess what I would say is that interestingly, I think, and this is also true, in fact, of some of the governors in Nigeria, not above them, but some of the governors in Nigeria. There is a desire that within their school systems there be something called life skills education. And life skills education actually among those that, again, when I talk about younger politicians who may at this point in time in their career be in charge of a district or maybe even a province or a state, but in many cases I think they're beginning to look at the whole concept of, here's what our educational system has. It doesn't really, in a variety of ways, meet the needs of someone who's going to come out of that educational system and live in our society. And I think one of the reasons that, interestingly, the concept of life skills has been important to younger politicians in a place like Nigeria is that in many of their urban spaces, it's the first time that people are living surrounded by people of other ethnic groups, other religions, et cetera, et cetera. They've all come from a place where it was one ethnic group, one religion, and they've come into the city and there's now a mix. And I think that younger politicians are beginning to say that group in particular needs to be exposed to life skills, and it begins to get at things like child spacing, family planning, et cetera.
Thank you. Jason?
Well, just to say, I'm not sure you've come to the right place to get comprehensive sexuality education. I don't think you're going to find it in the schools much here in the U.S. Happy to report that my kids got theirs through our ethical society and a Unitarian church, and so that's where also, here in the U.S. you often have to go for these kind of things. So I don't think that that's unique to Nepal or India. Comprehensive sexuality education, whether it's mixed in with a broader life skills or standalone, very effective if done well. Lot of experiences of just relying on teachers, handing a curriculum to teachers who are not comfortable talking about those topics, and then the program's actually not having strong outcomes. So if done well, very positive, but it requires some real thinking about who the messengers are, and who do youth want to hear from. And just to say that in many countries, unfortunately, girls aren't staying in school through secondary school and into those years where it's most important, and in many places also boys. So I think we have to really think about in-school and out-of-school spaces to reach people. And I am happy to report that that lots of donors within the family planning space are really rethinking their youth and adolescent investments, are growing those investments, but countries are still struggling to identify the technical assistance to help them to do these things right. So there's increasingly money towards this, but the resources towards doing it right at a country level are still wanting. And so strong future for those who want to go into youth and adolescent reproductive health. I encourage you, and I think there's a space to make a difference.
Eric, any thoughts on reaching youth?
Well, in general, I think things are changing. First of all, in terms of information and communication, well, IT are there. It's more and more difficult for governments to hide facts from people on everything, on population, health, water. If you Google anything, you find a lot of information. Looking at water, if you go to the website, for example, of the World Resource Institute, They do a pretty good job compiling basic data, but showing it in terms of graphs and maps, things that are very visual, things that used to be hidden into big USAID and World Bank reports. Now they are on maps, and anybody can see that. So that, I think, is going to change mentality, and especially young people, because, yeah, everybody has a cell phone today. And the other thing, I think also social norms are slowly changing and some taboos are falling. I'm very optimistic. I had, as I mentioned earlier, I visited Zambia a couple of years ago, and I really had one day something that it was quite emotional for me. I'm a man. I don't have, unfortunately, a daughter. I have 2 boys. But I was in a small village discussing school wash, and the village chief took a sanitary pad in his hand and was doing a presentation on a sanitary pad. That for me was, that day I was like, okay, it's worth working in this field. Something is happening. You know, because there are days when you work hard, and I've worked a lot in the Middle East, and sometimes in some countries it's difficult to change things. You go home, you're frustrated, you feel like you're bumping against a wall. Well, that day in Zambia, I felt like, well, there's something that's changing. You know, that proud old man holding it in his hand and explaining that he has several daughters and he's so happy that now they go to school and the sanitary pads have basically changed his life. His life. That was something.
Oh, that's amazing. And that's a fantastic note of hope to end on today. I feel a little bit like, I don't know if you guys watch SNL, but the Stefan character is like, this event had everything today, right? We had everything. So I'm really, really pleased that we covered so much ground, the whole world, and also the different time scales. And I think that's really important. That came through very much today. We're moving from a humanitarian emergency response immediacy to the long term, to something that's truly, truly transformative. And, you know, can we get to a place where, as Jason said, where this interconnectedness that we've all discussed and recognized and see, can we move just from seeing that as an innovation to seeing it as an essential foundation for how we tackle all of these challenges and really make the change that Eric spoke about? Well, thank you. I hope to see you all back here again soon, coming up in the 3rd and final event in this series on July 10th. We'll look at delve even deeper in some of the things that were mentioned here today: the demographic dividend, economic empowerment, and education. So please come back, and I hope you all will join me in thanking all of our panelists today. And go Caps! All right, thank you.